Thank you. So we're going to present Fire Up Your Test. It's just going to go through how we solve some testing problems with Firely. And I'm Dan Roberts. I've been a software developer in the healthcare industry for over 15 years. I've worked with a bunch of different companies, large and small, but now I'm with Amenities Health, which is a very small startup, and we're hoping to make actual meaningful fixes to our healthcare problems.
And I'm Daniel Posada. This is my second startup, but my first time in the health tech industry. I've been wanting to get into health tech for quite some time, and finally got the opportunity. Prior to Amenities, I have some experience in fintech and just general software consulting. I consider myself a testing nerd. I love thinking about how to test systems and how to automate those tests. And similar to Dan, I'm hoping that at Amenities we can build something that truly delights our users who are patients. So before we dive into kind of the technical part of the talk about testing specifically, I wanted to give a brief introduction to our company and what our vision is. And this is not meant to be a marketing pitch by any stretch, but I think kind of setting the stage around our company goals helps with our testing goals. So the vision of Amenities is to build patient loyalty to health systems. So a quick example of that, I live in Houston, Texas, and the Texas Medical Center is just a few minutes down the road from me. And there are tens of hospitals to choose from there, tens of health systems to choose from. And there's really no disincentive for me to go to one hospital today to see one doctor and then walk across the street to a different hospital tomorrow to see a different doctor. And this is a big problem for health systems. Health systems have a revenue problem, and they know that they want to retain their patients, but they don't really know what to do about it. They tend to be pretty good at taking care of sick people, but not so good at being consumer digital product companies. And so that's where Amenities comes in. We have some experience in the industry, and we have some ideas for how to help establish this sort of like brand loyalty to a health system. But at our core, what we're doing is we're building white labeled mobile apps for health systems that are meant to engage and delight the patient. And so the example that we like to use on the consumer side, on the patient side, is that we're the Costco of healthcare. So if you've ever been a Costco member, you've been willing to pay that annual fee for the privilege of driving past 5 other grocery stores in order to get to your Costco. And it's because there's something about their products or their experience that delights you enough that makes it worth it to you. And that's the same sort of delight that we want to have, that we want to establish with patients at health systems. And then on the health system executive side, the analogy we like to use is the Salesforce analogy. So Salesforce is this massive e-commerce platform that's used by both small mom and pop water bottle stores and massive retailers like Nestle, Whole Foods, and Tesla. And the reason it makes sense for this sort of wide spectrum of companies to use Salesforce is that none of those companies wants to invest in payment processing systems or shipping systems or logistics. They want that to just work for them. And that's what Salesforce provides. And that's similar to what we're trying to accomplish. We want to build a consumer digital platform that health systems can just use without having to invest in it themselves. And so sort of the first problem that we're attacking is the patient portal. So this is the system where you can see your doctors and your appointments and your medications and all that stuff. And we're viewing that as sort of the stepping stone for building these future engagement features. But the reason all of this is relevant to the meat of this talk, which is testing our systems, is that patient portal is a pretty complex system in that it grabs data from many other places. And so that's where the complexity of testing our platform comes in. Okay, so let's get into sort of the architecture of our system. And this is a very high level sort of cartoony view of the architecture, but it's good for this conversation. So on the left-hand side, you can see our mobile app. I've got it sort of grayed out because what we're really interested in testing here is that middle circle, which is our backend API. So that's the system under test that we're going to be talking about. And then on the right-hand side, you can see these sort of like 3 example source systems that we pull data from. So on the top, there's the health system EMR. And then in the middle, there's the provider search data. And then on the bottom, there's provider reviews data. And what we'll talk about in just a minute is that all three of these systems end up becoming sources of flakiness for our tests. And so that's really the problem that we're trying to solve, is how can we reduce the flakiness in our integration tests? Before we dive into that, just a quick introduction to FHIR Server. If you're at this conference and you're at this talk, you probably know about it, but I just wanted to kind of level set. So it's an enterprise grade FHIR server built in .NET. It implements all of the major FHIR standards, so STU3, R4, and R5. But where its power really was for us is the fact that it's a turnkey solution that is extremely easy to set up. So I've got this Docker run command near the bottom of the slide, and that's literally the command that we use to start it up in our environment. And then it's also worth mentioning that you can use it out of the box. So this Docker run command will give you something that you can start sending requests to create FHIR resources and then retrieve them. But it also has the ability to let you customize it for many different purposes. So you can use it as sort of like a facade for some other backend systems that you have. But we used it in a very vanilla way. We didn't do any customization. We just fired it up with Docker and then started using it for our needs. Okay, so let's go back to that flakiness problem that I touched on a second ago. So really the problem that we had was that we were relying on systems that we don't control in our tests. So those three example systems, the EMR, provider search, and provider reviews, those are systems that are owned by our customers, the health system, and therefore we don't control them. And so let me give a quick example. Let's say that in our patient portal mobile app, we want to show the patient their upcoming appointments, and we want to test that functionality through our API. We might have a test patient that we're using, and we might have a couple of upcoming appointments on that patient so that we can assert that when we retrieve that data through our API, that the right appointments show up. And if something very simple like someone at the health system deletes that demo patient, all of a sudden our tests start to fail. So this is one example of many different ways that relying on systems that you don't control can cause your tests to be flaky. And so what we ended up doing was we decided to regain control by essentially cutting out those third-party systems that we don't control, at least the ones of them that are FHIR based, and replace them with FHIR Server. And that allowed us to point our API at FHIR Server and create our own data elements, our own resources in FHIR Server, and have an ecosystem that was completely under our control for the purposes of our integration tests. And the reason this works is that really what we're interested in testing is the logic inside of that middle circle, the backend API, and that logic is not affected by where the data comes from as long as the schemas are the same. So as long as the requests and response are the same, which with FHIR you sort of get that out of the box, this solution works. And so you can see in this simplified diagram down at the bottom, we've basically dropped in FHIR and replaced those third-party systems with FHIR Server. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Dan now to talk about some of the wins that we got out of this approach.
Yeah, so the big win that we've already talked about a lot is reliability. We wanted to remove that flakiness, and this gave us that safety net, so to speak, where we control the data. And you don't want to be right in the middle of coding and passing all of your unit tests, and then you move on to all your other test suites and hold up PRs or commits because of failures there that are outside of your control. So stopping that was basically our top priority. And this did a great job of it. Full control over the data. And this includes writing data, which was a big important factor for us. We're no longer reliant on asking the client to give us certain things that we needed to hit our test scenario coverage. So that was a big win. Another big win that was unexpected was how easy it was to set up, which Daniel already touched on a little bit. But during the process, when we got it working, we had this moment where we were like, we had to have done something wrong, because this was so quick and easy to set up that surely we missed something. But no, it actually is. It's really simple and really easy to get up and running. And then finally, this just gave us the comfort that all of our logic within our API was being tested in a near real environment, which is important. You know, you get the added coverage of the integration test that you don't necessarily cover with a unit test. So you're making a call to somewhere. We're just replacing that somewhere with FHIR server.
Just
yeah.
as a heads up, we've got about 5 minutes before we open it up for questions. So you know.
Okay. Thank you. So we had a couple lessons learned, right? And that is FHIR is great, but not all the systems that we would like to replace use FHIR. So we ran into a couple letdowns there. There's still things that we would like to replace. We just can't because there's not a FHIR server equivalent for some of those things. And then just in general, when working on a project like this, the we don't know anything mindset is a good practice to have, because a lot of things that you think going in make sense turn out to really just be the biggest problems that you run into. So one example of that, and anybody that's worked in healthcare has probably run into this, but you're working with a client and they have an EMR and they want you to get to the data in that EMR, it seems reasonable to expect that you would have that access. But that's actually not the case a lot of times, which sounds crazy, but that's just the world that we live in with healthcare and some of the control that the EMRs have over the data. And then no single test category is ever going to be enough coverage to do everything that you wanted to do. So you'll have unit tests, you'll have integration test and functional testing, regression testing, all these different buzzwords for testing. But what we found is that if you sometimes take an outside of the box approach to it, like we did with FHIR testing, just making something up, as long as it works, that's what's important. It might not fall into like a category necessarily to say like these are strictly integration tests, but they do the job that you need them to do. And that's really the important part there. So this slide's about like things that we'd like to implement in the future. So naturally, when you put something in that allows you to replace asking the client for things, the next step then was other internal resources say, oh, that's pretty amazing that you guys can do this. Now, can you do it for us? So we kind of ran into this situation where we became a replacement for asking the client for stuff. So then naturally that leads you down the path of maybe we should put a UI in front of this so that anybody in the organization can do it. And eventually you get to the point where it's like, why don't we just write our own EMR? So which is obviously a joke because that's a huge undertaking, but and then another big future improvement, which I already talked about a little bit, is anything that's not FHIR. So FHIR server worked amazing for this, right? Like it's still something that we use and it works great, but anything that's not FHIR or even older versions of FHIR that aren't supported by FHIR server, which you would think there's no way that there's still people using DSTU2 versions, but there are. Sadly, there's health systems out there that are large health systems that are just on old versions of FHIR. So we ran into that problem. As a future improvement, we'd like to be able to fake other stuff. And then we also have this concept that would be really nice, stretch goal, I guess, and that is introducing forms of chaos into the test with FHIR, ways to make just things happen that you don't expect to happen, just to see how your test handle it. So that's definitely an idea that we had. And then here's our contact information and the Hoove app, and then our direct emails if you wanted to ask us something. And then I think we can, go into the Q&A, which we put some images here from the presentation just as like a reference to look at.
Thank you so much. That was great. So anyone here in the room, are there any questions from this presentation?
You mentioned wanting to create a UI to, I presume, seed data into the test environment. Why, if these tests are being driven by developers that presumably are familiar with the FHIR format, are there like ways to do it without a UI?
Yeah, so in our automated tests, we did all that in an automated fashion, just with API requests to FHIR server. But the topic that Dan was introducing was this idea that maybe we could use that same sort of fake backend system for the actual mobile application when testing features internally. So it worked so well for integration tests that we started to say, well, why don't we see if we can point the mobile app at the API that's pointing at FHIR server and use that to test or to do a sales demo or an internal demo. And that got to the point where it was useful enough that we started asking, well, what if I wanted to create a new patient? And these questions were being asked not necessarily by engineers, but by non-technical folks as well.
Any other questions? I'll just check online to see if there's anything. No, it looks like we're all set. Thank you, Daniel and Dan, for a great presentation. And I'm sure FHIR appreciates that you're showing off their technology at this conference. But yeah, that was excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.